Well, the U.S. is singular in its gun culture. The U.S. Library of Congress studied different legal approaches to gun ownership around the world. Now, despite sharing plenty with the U.S. culturally, there are far fewer gun deaths in Canada. Semi-automatic weapons are restricted and handguns are generally prohibited. The UK has some exceptions to ownership. Handguns are not permitted among the general public, but there are allowances for firearms and shotguns for police. Meanwhile, Spain has some of the toughest laws on gun ownership in Europe. Gun ownership is limited to people whose jobs require them, and automatic weapons are strictly forbidden to civilians. Singapore's laws are perhaps the strictest in the world. The small Asian country hardly allows guns at all. If ordinary citizens try to use a weapon, the punishment is death. Meanwhile, Australia is perhaps the best example of enacting stricter gun laws following a mass shooting. In 1996, 35 people were killed in a mass shooting in Tasmania. Soon after, the government passed a law banning all automatic and semi-automatic firearms. They also created a buyback program that took some 650,000 guns out of circulation. Well, for a deeper look at the firearm industry in the US, let's cross to Jeffrey Moore, senior analyst with Global Risk Insights. He joins us from Raleigh, North Carolina. Thank you for being with us.
You're welcome. Good evening.
Now, what are some of the main reasons we tend to see gun stocks jump after a deadly attack like the one we saw in Las Vegas?
Yeah, well, there are many factors, but you've seen that relationship become a one-for-one relationship, especially in the last 10 years or so, with the election of President Barack Obama in 2008 and a lot of rhetoric from the left side of the aisle politically about gun control. Every time you saw a mass shooting or an attack, there was an anticipation of further discussions and political rhetoric about gun control. And traders tend to get in front of those moves almost in a mechanical nature, and they would bid those gun stocks and manufacturers up. And we've seen that time and time again over the last 6, 7, 10 years.
So with the concerns that some gun owners had under President Barack Obama's leadership then, how has the endorsement from the NRA for President Trump affected gun manufacturers and sales in the U.S.?
Yeah, I think you've seen the difference in that relationship really come to pass through this latest massacre that happened in Las Vegas, where the gun stocks initially did pop on news of the massacre, but as investors and traders came to the understanding that there's not as likely of a movement or momentum for further gun control measures under a President Trump and a Republican Congress, you've seen those gun stocks actually come down in the last few days, and they're not enjoying the kind of pop that they've had after some of our other shootings under President Barack Obama. So that NRA endorsement certainly tempers the worries about gun control and confiscation, and therefore it reduces the urge for people to go out and load up on some of these weapons for fear of them being banned in the near future.
So give us some context. Just how lucrative is the gun industry in the U.S., say, compared to other countries?
I'm sorry, can you repeat that?
Sure. How lucrative is the gun industry in the U.S. compared to other countries?
Compared to other countries, I would say that it is far and away, as far as the domestic market for individual gun ownership, probably the most profitable market in the world. As was mentioned in the report, there are close to 300 million guns as an estimate in the United States, and gun manufacturers and gun retailers, even in my home state of North Carolina, have been enjoying really boom years, the best of times as far as their profit margins are concerned. As people get more and more into ownership, they have an urge or an inclination to purchase guns they think may be banned. And also as that the kind of culture shifts to more and more markets for recreational gun use, they've had a steady stream of customers coming in.
Now, Australia started banning certain types of weapons, instituted its buyback program, and also tightened regulations since that shooting in the mid-1990s. But what happens to these guns that are taken out of circulation?
Yeah, for the guns that are taken out of circulation, I know in Australia they've got an exchange program, and many of those are destroyed. There are similar programs on a local level in the United States. Local police departments may do gun exchanges, kind of anonymous gun drop-offs, where they'll actually purchase guns from off the streets that may be illegal or unjustifiably owned. And many of those are also destroyed. So whenever you have an effort by local enforcement authorities to reduce the amount of illegal or unjustified gun ownership, you're going to have those weapons destroyed or put into markets where they're more regulated. Some of those likely go into the inventories of training facilities for police departments and the like. But most likely they'll be destroyed.
Now, how does the gun industry tend to adapt to these sort of initiatives that really either cut back the number of guns or ban them altogether?
Yeah, well, while there has been a lot of rhetoric about gun control in the past decade or so, there has not been to any large degree, really noticeable crackdowns as far as legislation being enacted. So while there's an ebb and flow to the gun sales and the revenues to those gun companies as different tragic events come and the political rhetoric heats up, there hasn't been a whole lot of examples of the rubber meeting the road as far as gun control. And so gun manufacturers in the United States and those manufacturers of accessories and sporting goods around the gun and shooting industries have had a pretty steady environment as far as actual regulation. There have been a few attempts to regulate the size of magazines and handguns, for instance, in New York State, and some other initiatives to ban or regulate some accessories to guns, the latest being a push to ban bumper stock technologies and accessories, which was reportedly used by the murderer in Las Vegas just a few weeks ago.
And Jeffrey, just quickly, what would be the economic incentive then for governments either to reduce or allow more ownership of guns?
Yeah, well, as far as the reduction, they've got those studies that really imply that there's a heavy economic burden as far as gun violence in the United States. But in the United States, there's also a unique relationship between the premise and the principle of gun ownership and those very freedoms that the country is founded upon. So to a large degree, Second Amendment rights and gun ownership are not up for debate. They're not negotiable. So as the risk of moving too far in that gun control space may be a risk of undoing some of those protections that start down a slippery slope of regulating more and more industries outside of just guns and maybe affecting the economy in a negative way that way.